because I haven't seen Dr. Strober's CV in a long time, but I can tell you this. He's an internationally recognized expert in this disorder. He's published a ton of stuff, articles, research, books, chapters. He's a deep thinker, he's a thought leader, but more than all of that to me is he is an incredibly experienced clinician. Besides all that stuff, he still sees patients, he still supervises groups. Putting it all together, I think of him as perhaps the most knowledgeable and experienced expert in this field, maybe anywhere. And I mean that. And every time I come to listen to him talk, I learn something new and really interesting about anorexia nervosa. With no further ado, Dr. Strober.
Dr. McCracken, do you want to add to that? Yes? Okay, let the party begin. I became curious about anorexia nervosa shortly after I came to UCLA and began to pursue a career in my other interest, which remains active, which is the evolution of mania and melancholia when it begins early in development. The two areas of research have crossed paths, but they begin with a reference to something I read when I was in graduate school at the University of Pittsburgh. It's David Hume's Enquiry in Human Understanding. It's an extraordinary piece, and in it, Hume laments the fact that so much of what is known has been forgotten. That can be said about the pediatric onset of manic depression and melancholia. Kreplin made reference to it in his brilliant monograph, the English translation of which was published, I think, in 1916. And also Leo Kanner's position. This is appears in the second edition of his textbook of child psychiatry, in which he said, child psychiatry doesn't really need to be concerned about melancholia and mania because they are madness that doesn't begin to appear until very late adolescence, early adulthood. Kreplin noted that the peak period for first onsets of manic depression, at least the incidence, rises at age 15 through 19. So this is essentially an opinion piece, but it's an opinion piece that is backed up by a very, very solid foundation in science. It's not the science that our field, and I'm speaking now of the study of anorexia nervosa, that has much understanding of, and in some circles, as we'll discover in a moment, it's met with a good bit of derision, an accusation. Several papers that I published about 5 years ago in which I talked about the importance of understanding the ultimate causation of anorexia nervosa from a very, very broad base of science. And I mentioned the importance of developmental psychopathology. I mentioned the importance of evolutionary behavior, of evolutionary biology, of Darwinian evolution by natural selection. And there were howls of protest. There was hissing. I was accused of being unapologetically Freudian. And I didn't know what to think about that. I thought, well, maybe it was a compliment, but maybe it wasn't. And in this case, it wasn't. So I'm going to be talking about these tensions as it relates to this. This is a case of anorexia nervosa. The history that precedes this is a common one. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the implications. Wallace Arthur, who wrote in Biased Embryos in Evolution about the perils of false assertions. We're going to be talking about false assertions as it relates to anorexia nervosa, and he said, in the world of life, always beware of generalization. It's science's duty, it's pleasure to attempt them, but they are often wrong, or at the very least subject to some if, buts, and exceptions. Several years ago at the Eating Disorder Research Society, I made the point that the defining elements of anorexia nervosa can be understood, and quite persuasively and with strong justification, as adaptive innovation shaped over the evolutionary timescale by natural selection in pre-human species, because they benefited survival and reproductive fitness. I'm going to be talking about that, and time permitting, we'll get to the implications for treatment, of which there are several. By the way, if anyone wants, I put a lot of information in here. If anyone wants the slides, you're welcome to it. If you want to use the slides, you just have to let me know. So all of this material is freely available to anybody smart enough to want it. So if you assume that natural selection is your frame of reference, if you assume that, if you take that as fact, and you're thinking about the ultimate causation, the origin of this very, very opaque illness, very costly illness, the ultimate causation of anorexia nervosa, seen in evolutionary terms, is intuitive, and I'm going to illustrate that. And the frame of reference here suggests that the core elements, behavior, physiology, biology, morphology, can be understood as evolved ancestral phenotypes that promoted the safety of life forms as they navigated unfamiliar environments where the avoidance of predators, the risk of having your body mass consumed by something either bigger than you or more cagey than you, was evolution's crucial priority. One person said, I had anorexia nervosa. I knew who this person was. He's now involved in a treatment program in the Midwest. And he said, I am a human being. I'm not an ancestral animal. I take offense. There was nothing about anorexia nervosa when I had it that was adaptive. Well, I shook my head and proceeded with a talk that was met with mixed emotion, mixed opinion. Some people had favorable reactions, and there were those who said I was unapologetically Freudian, which I didn't quite know what that meant. So I'm going to suggest how and why there's a very persuasive incentive for considering the ultimate causation of anorexia nervosa within an evolutionary biological framework. And this provides us with an opportunity to give thought to how the illness should be approached. I hope to leave time for questions so we can discuss the implications for treatment. The argument here is that the pre-illness developmental history, the behavioral aspects, the physiology, the morphology, the cognitive characteristics that you see acutely in anorexia nervosa have implications for understanding at a much deeper level its pathogenicity. My point here, which is well supported by recent science that I'm going to outline briefly, is that you cannot assume that anorexia nervosa stands on its own as an entity. Our field from very, very early on has seen anorexia nervosa as an entity having no bearing, no relationship to any other psychopathological phenotypes. That's just wrong. It does not stand alone, whether we're talking about theory, whether we're talking about clinical applications, whether we're talking about the broad history of the human condition. It has unique features. That's not in question. It's costly. That's not in question. The urgency of care is not in question. But the evidence is strong that the heritability of anorexia nervosa, the first attempt to characterize the heritability of anorexia nervosa was published in I think it was 1985 in the Journal of Psychiatric Research. And I showed that using a very, very crude method of defining heritability or calculating heritability, that there was at least modest heritability of anorexia nervosa. And the more complex approaches to genetic analyses today bear that out. But anorexia nervosa doesn't operate, the genes that operate in anorexia nervosa, which remain unknown, are shared in common with a variety of other complex phenotypes. Obsessive compulsive illness in particular, but also neuroticism, depression, and schizophrenia. And let's talk about obsessive compulsive illness. The prevalence of the lifetime morbidity of obsessive compulsive disorder and anorexia nervosa ranges from 30 to 50%, depending upon the study you look at. And the compulsions almost always begin prior to weight loss. Some are accentuated with weight loss, but the majority of people who have anorexia nervosa and who have classic obsessional illness, classic compulsive disease, have its onset prior to weight loss. And the prevailing causal framework in the case of phobias and compulsions hold that they arose from overactive, archaic fear modules that remain in certain presumably at-risk individuals. And it follows straightforwardly then that considering the heritability of anorexia nervosa, all of its major clinical features, also the very strange consciousness, which I'll talk about briefly, that defines the illness, cannot be understood without reference to acquired evolutionary defenses that were selected along the evolutionary timescale. It's an intuitive notion. Any of you know about the pronghorn? The pronghorn, an antelope-like mammal. They're indigenous to the American plains. 3 million years ago, they occupied the plains with their natural predators. They were the big cats, including the cheetah. The cheetah, as many of you know, is the fastest land animal on Earth. The pronghorn, however, are the fastest land animals for distance. The pronghorn are capable of maintaining a top speed of upwards of 65 to 70 miles an hour for 5 miles. They don't break. Clearly, Darwinian evolution selected not only speed, the pronghorn are the second fastest land animal, but the capacity to oxygenate to support this very energetic trait. The pronghorn. This is in Texas. Without provocation, this is what they do. They take off and they run for miles. And eventually, they stop and they do something that evolutionists and ecologists referred to as mobbing. Now, why would the pronghorn have an archaic ancestral defense activated in the absence of their natural predators? What is the reason? How does it come about? Running is costly, requires a great deal of energy, and the answer that John Byers gave was that the pronghorn run from the ghosts of predators past. And I'm going to describe the relevance of the ghosts of predators past to anorexia nervosa. There are some historical footnotes. They should be mentioned. Richard Morton, in his monograph on consumption, tuberculosis, described 2 cases of what he referred to as nervous atrophy. He attributed it to passions of the mind. And in his discussion, he said, how can people who appear so present in life with a prodigious energy be so withered, yet swoon when approached, even with small morsels of food? Swoon was his word, not mine, but it's illustrative of the strange phenomenology of anorexia nervosa. William Gull said it seemed hardly possible that a body so wasted could undergo the exercise which seemed agreeable. Why would pronghorn waste energy in the absence of their evolutionary predators? The pronghorn have no real robust predators at this point in time. Gull famously said that the inclination of the patient should not be consulted. The tendency of the physician to indulge the patient's caprice in the endless stream of rationalization. But I ate an hour ago. Elizabeth and I are going to have our dinner together soon. I don't need to eat. I've already eaten. I'm going to eat. Why do you pester me with your accusations that I am in danger? He said these rationalizations, these excuses should be discouraged. And then he said something that causes the consternation of some people today in this field. Parents are sometimes the worst attendants. I don't believe this, but it strikes to the heart of what people believe is the most well-established treatment for young people with anorexia nervosa. At one time, it was referred to as the Maudsley method. I know those investigators. They're very talented clinicians. Today, it's referred to as family-based treatment. I know those investigators as well. It has its place, but as to the assertion, it is the treatment of choice. It is superior to other treatments. It's robust. It's the gold standard. It's the holy grail. Those things are false. Anorexia nervosa has had a place in psychosomatic medicine for some time. This appears in an early 20th century textbook on psychosomatic medicine. Today, this illness remains unsatisfactorily explained. Decades ago, there was a belief that it was a resonance of modern culture, and this was based on well-established evidence that young women have an unease with their natural body weight. There's no question that that's the case. Studies dating back to the 1960s in Sweden noted that about 60% of women who were surveyed about the desire for weight loss endorsed the need, in spite of having no tangible reason to lose weight. This is transient. Anorexia nervosa is not transient. It has costs. The dangers are clear. The causal motivation it's opaque. Patients stubbornly defend the need for further weight loss. It's manifestly peculiar and counterintuitive, at least so it seems. Recovery requires a long stretch of time. Take as comparison acute psychotic mania in a 14-year-old. 4 weeks, lithium monotherapy. It is not unusual to see complete resolution of the episode. Anorexia nervosa does not give ground easily. Here are the predictable questions that are asked by parents. Why is my child suddenly, quickly, intractably drawn into a state of mind that has no logic? It has no common sense. Why is she blind to her true appearance? Why is the young woman relaxing on a beach indifferent to her corpse-like appearance, and who would likely reject the idea that she needs care because her body weight is too low? Is she doing this on purpose? Is she doing this to hurt us? Can she refrain from this utterly senseless behavior? Is she in the grips of something she doesn't understand and can't stop? Here are the common assertions about anorexia nervosa today, and they are often declared as an emphatic truth. Each lacks any empirical support. Anorexia nervosa is a genetic disorder. It's a brain disorder, implying that there's some straight line between mutated genes and this phenotype. It is the result of malnutrition. Malnutrition brings this on. Malnutrition is the causal factor. It is at the heart of pathogenicity. And the psychopathology is going to mysteriously resolve once normal weight has been restored. That's false. There should be no need to invoke environmental programming by life events as adversive. It has no role in the genesis of this illness. I don't believe that environmental factors alone cause anorexia nervosa. The causality is much more complicated, but this statement is false. We know that the brain responds to even minor perturbations resulting from environmental events. Psychotherapy must be put on hold until weight is normalized. Well, this is false. There is a certain treatment superior to others. As I said, it's false, and the correct target weight is either the population average for age and height, or it should be based on the patient's pre-illness weight trajectory. This is false. It's nonsensical. Several months ago, I was asked to consult on the case of a 13-year-old who was 5'2". She was in treatment. Her weight was very, very low. And the dietitian, this is no slant to dietitians, but the dietitian, because of her pre-illness weight trajectory, advised the target weight range of 153 pounds. Yes, it's madness. It's iatrogenic. It's insane. It's damaging. It's costly. I said that to the dietitian, and that went nowhere. The fact is, well before weight loss, we see, in most cases, not in all, but the large majority of cases, an uncommonly well-mannered, dutiful, conscientious child who is more attentive to the needs of others than to herself. She's self-disciplined, she's cautious, she's made uneasy by change, she's avoidant, she's prone to anxious worry. At least 30% of people with anorexia nervosa have full threshold anxiety syndromes. That includes obsessive compulsive disorder, whether you think of that as a habit disorder or as a classical anxiety disorder. And what patients will eventually say is, I am not prepared for the suddenness of life as a pubertal adolescent. I am not prepared for the myriad of bewildering and novel events that attend adolescent life in our modern society. The weight loss is innocent. I have never met a single person in 44 years with classical anorexia nervosa who said, my goal is to look like a cadaver. I want to look corpse-like. I have never met a person who has espoused that life principle. The weight loss is usually benign. Sometimes it's occasioned by the recommendation that you change your diet, you avoid red meat. Very, very soon after nutrients are restricted, very soon, well before malnutrition, she is absorbed. Anorexia nervosa occurs in males. They are absorbed in a minutia of calorie counting. They feel an urgent need for weight loss. It is the most important persuasive element within her consciousness. It doesn't matter who appeals to her. It doesn't matter how fraught the parents are. It doesn't matter how forceful they are in trying to get her to eat more. She will not concede any point but her own. All of a sudden, this well-mannered, dutiful, attentive, conscientious child acts as though the only opinion that matters is hers, and the opinion that is most persuasive is a form of madness. It seems utterly, utterly without reason or logic. And at the same time that this begins, at the same time you have this very, very slow increment of weight loss, all of a sudden the body is perceived as large. The body mass must be reduced. Sometimes she doesn't see how thin she is, sometimes she does, but she still feels compelled to drive her weight down. And unaware of the fact that this proclivity that she has toward anxiousness, regimentation, over-habitized behavior plays a role in what is now evolving. Some recent science is relevant to the point, to the premise here. In a study that the group I'm involved in just published in Nature Genetics, it was a study that involved 16,000 cases of anorexia nervosa. So we have 16,000 samples of DNA, 55,000 controls. The results of this GWAS study was that anorexia nervosa was polygenic. Well, that's not surprising. All complex phenotypes are polygenic. But importantly, it was associated, case status was associated with genetic correlations with OCD. That correlation, looking at the entire genome, single nucleotide polymorphisms across the genome, was 0.5. In a family study we published in 2007, we showed that obsessive compulsive disorder aggregates in first-degree relatives of people with anorexia nervosa, even when you control obsessive compulsive disorder in the proband. In other words, remove the fact, take into consideration that proband comorbidity plays a role, control for that, obsessive compulsive disorder and multiple other anxiety phenotypes were elevated significantly in the first-degree relatives. So the correlation with obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety, neuroticism was not unexpected. There's also a correlation with major depressive disorder. Major depressive disorder is not that common in anorexia nervosa, but generalized anxiety is. And we know there's a genetic relationship, there's a developmental genetic relationship between generalized anxiety and major depressive disorder, which emerges in anxious children around the ages of 15 to 25 in about 30%. In an article published that we were involved in, published in Science, I'm proud to say I was one of, I think, 689 authors. The focus was on shared heritability again, but in this case, the focus was on psychiatric phenotypes and neurological phenotypes. Psychiatric phenotypes tend to cluster together. They had gene sharing. Psychiatric phenotypes appeared to have no causal genetic relationship with the neurological phenotypes. And now there is reason to believe that the genes involved in whatever the core pathway is are actually spread throughout the entire genome. Why some people advocate omnigenic models for complex psychiatric disorders. So there are core genes, and then there are genes that are widely distributed that seem to act on these core genes. And these are genes that are distributed throughout the entire genome. So we are moving from complexity to complexity in our attempt to understand all complex psychiatric phenotypes. So coming back to the premise, there is a very good reason, quite persuasive, for studying the ancestral past as it may pertain to the characteristic features you see in anorexia nervosa. It's also important here to understand what is the risk of a clinician's illusion. And very simply, psychological symptoms, they're painful, they're detrimental, they cause great discomfort. We treat them. You have a fever, it's treated. Fever expresses heat shock genes, proteins, which enhance immunity. So genes that we think and phenotypes that we think are dangerous and should be treated as soon as possible are also adaptogenic. We know from work by Timbergen, Lorenz, von Frisch, Dobzhansky, that you cannot explain a trait that you believe has a biological element. Anorexia nervosa has genetic determinants. There are genes that allow for rapid weight loss. Try to lose the weight that's depicted on that slide. I tried to gain weight when I was working at the Concord Hotel, which was north of New York City. I had the opportunity to work in the coffee shop and eat whatever I wanted because my uncle owned the coffee shop. And I was frail, I was thin, I was gangly. I was picked on by people who were big and who weren't gangly. And I said, well, I have to gain weight. I have to gain weight and then I have to put on muscle. And I could not gain a pound. The more I ate, the sicker I felt. So there is a facilitative biology in anorexia nervosa. But the point made here is that you have to understand behavior from an evolutionary point of view to understand its point, why it came to be, the evolutionary pressures that gave it adaptive significance. Dobzhansky famously said, you can't understand biology without understanding evolution. George Steiner, this quote appears in Eric Kandel's book, In Search of Memory. He said, each new historical period mirrors itself in the picture and active mythology of the past. It's a brilliant quote. Steiner was not a mental health professional. He's not a scientist. He's a culturist. He was a literary critic. He was very interested in the evolution and devolution of culture. In his book, in Bluebeard's Castle, he said, we catalog memory, we catalog sensations, we catalog perceptions, we catalog habit action to allow for continuity and coherence. If there is no connectivity of past to present, there is no adaptation. Ideas and logic don't form a perfect democracy, he said, which means that some ideas, some forms of logic, some pronouncements, some beliefs take precedent over others. In anorexia nervosa, we have a belief that the body is too large and there is urgency in reducing it. Coming back to Darwin, at the end of On the Origin of Species, he said that all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was breathed. He's referring to what we now know as the universal common ancestor, the last one. The last common universal ancestor of every current living organism. The estimate is that it lived 3 to 4 billion years ago. And it makes the point that no matter the simplicity or complexity of the living organism, we all descend genealogically from a single, very ancient species. And the molecular evidence is very, very strong. Every living thing has the same DNA and RNA code. Every living thing. The genes that regulate the evolution of a body plan are very few. They're highly conserved. And they are the same genes that show up in every evolutionarily blueprinted body plan. Lalande, in Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, said that modern humans share a history with species that began life over 3 billion years ago. This means that 99% of human evolution was driven by the same drivers, the same biological drives that shaped their design until 3 million years ago, when the propensities of early human beings began to co-involve with the evolution of modern culture, which gave us an infinite library of analogies to reason with. What separates animals, non-human animals, from humans is that we have the capacity to make sense and nonsense of our behavior, our adaptations, in ways that can be very, very strange, very costly, but still are underscored by adaptive evolutionary traits. I'm going to try to finish up in 5 minutes. But if you look at evolution, if you study obsessive compulsive disorder, if you have an interest in how our visual attention systems develop, we now know that constrictor and venomous snakes were pivotal in shaping mammalian brain evolution. Our visual system is evolutionarily shaped in the sense that it's biased towards ancestrally threatening objects. People who have never seen a snake, who've never seen a spider, will have their amygdala light up to a degree far greater than other non-threatening objects on the screen. We are prepared to rapidly condition fear to objects dangerous to early humans. Our neuronal systems are correlated with avoidance behavior that is rapidly recruited. Hence, the speed with which this woman, I don't know who this woman is, somebody I work with sent me the slide because she said, you know, you should use this in a presentation. So here she is. This woman probably lost the majority of her weight over the course of 3 to 4 months. Now imagine that, losing 50% of your natural body weight rapidly over the course of 3 months. Clearly there's a facilitative biology. And when she's asked, would you like help? Can I show you to a hospital? Her answer is, why would I do that? I need to lose more weight. So clearly there is an adaptogenic process operating and it can only be understood from an evolutionary blueprint. Consider, low body mass is selected in birds for rapid takeoff, speed, and agility. There are species that can rapidly adjust their body mass downward as predation risks become more unpredictable. Embryos exposed to odorous cues coming from predators exhibit avoidance and low body mass. The lag time to forage is increased upon exposure to predators. That's intuitive. And as predator density increases, prey settle on less nutrient-rich food patches. Again, we're thinking about what is the history that brings people to have the biology, the physiology to lose weight rapidly, and what is its adaptive purpose? Low body mass is a defensive morphology in multiple ecosystems where large predators favor consuming prey where the energy gain is high. In other words, the evolution has favored low body mass because the predators in that ecosystem prefer higher body mass prey. There is something called aposematic selection, which refers to the fact that a trait can be selected if it deviates from the template that a predator uses to search for, identify, kill, and consume prey. If you come across a prey animal, that deviates from what you think a prey animal should look like, and it appears unpalatable, disease-ridden, you pass it by. And that capacity to maintain low body mass for an extended period of time, given that you have to habitate in ecosystems where predator density is high, becomes selected. Subordinate fish, there are fish that are subordinate, there are fish that are dominant. Subordinate fish impose on themselves food restriction. Now, why would they do that? The purpose is so the dominant fish are not threatened. And this maintains a social hierarchy. And in maintaining the social hierarchy, those subordinates are preserved within that system. They are allowed to be part of that social hierarchy, so they're not extruded to face predators on their own. Well, why do things that served a purpose millions of years ago linger when the risk of predation is low? Why do the pronghorn run? What releases it? There's no predator that is provocative in any way. So why do the ghosts of predators past maintain behavior? Daniel Blumstein, who chairs our Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, said, well, it's intuitive if you consider that hardwire anxious avoidant traits may also maintain sensitivity to new, modern, high novelty environments. In a sense, the modern environment functions like an extinct predator. Also, the genes that are associated with anorexia nervosa have a clear adaptive purpose: vigilance, tenacity, hard work, unrelenting discipline, sensitivity to others. They all serve a purpose today, which is why the traits that are correlated with that will be preserved in the modern environment, even though they are evolutionary in their ultimate causation. I'll just skip. So we have at least 15 minutes of questions. So, well, okay. What does this mean to those of us who spend time with human beings? Is this beneficial in any way? You're running from the ghosts of predators past. They sometimes look at you cross-eyed, but not always, because your goal is to convince them that there is a logic that is more persuasive than theirs. And you have to do it with great compassion. You have to give them a reason to adopt your point of view rather than theirs. They have to be dissuaded from pursuing a phenotype that is very costly and which represents a phenotype that has the highest mortality, standardized mortality of any psychiatric disorder. We snicker about people who have this ailment. Years and years ago, I used to watch Saturday Night Live and watched Lorraine Newman denigrate herself because of her thinness. And it may have been related to her addiction to cocaine, but the point is people assumed she had an eating disorder. One potential implication is for novel pharmacotherapies. There's a classic experiment out of Michael Meany's laboratory at McGill, which brilliantly showed that you can environmentally program rat pups to be anxious and to have high arousability depending upon how much licking and grooming they receive by their mothers. And rats differ in the frequency and intensity of their licking and grooming. Rats nursed by mothers who lick and groom minimally are anxious, and that anxiety phenotypes, those phenotypes persist into their adolescence. Meany showed that there was an epigenetic programming of the glucocorticoid receptor gene that led to impaired cortisol feedback, which led to this anxiety phenotype. The gene was methylated During the adolescence, he showed that if you demethylate that gene, if you enzymatically demethylate the gene, these anxious rat pups become resilient. They become tolerant of novelty. The face of anxiety was eliminated. So there are potentials for novel pharmacotherapies. It does help to reframe the psychotherapeutic framework. Some time ago, someone who came to UCLA said during her time at a residential program that I won't mention, I was told that I had to make peace with my food. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. You're not at war with your food. You have developed a very, very strange battle with your body mass. And I'll tell you how this evolved and how it relates something that you know well about yourself. You are an anxious, over-disciplined, tireless worker. You have a proclivity to fear, to be worried. You have little tolerance for the change you're in the midst of. And as I am discussing the sort of ultimate causation, and you also have the ability to lose weight very rapidly in those Nature Genetic and Science articles, what anorexia nervosa was also associated with is low body mass and variations that we don't understand in hormonal processes. Low body mass, clearly associated with what we see in the phenotype, and clearly suggesting that to tell a 13-year-old at 5'2", who's never weighed more than, I think, 100 pounds, and who's in the throes of a psychopathology that has phobic and avoidant behavior at its heart, and whose natural tendency is to have a low body weight, that you need to weigh 153 pounds is just rank stupidity. We also know that there are genes expressed in high anxious rats during exposure to novelty and the conditioning of fear that is different from the genes expressed in low anxious rats, suggesting that this frame of reference might aid the continuing studies of the genetic architecture of complex disease. It may refine the search for genes. And also, people need to be pushed against the conventional boundaries. There's somebody sitting in the last row, Ruben Martinez, who has spent the last week walking around campus with his patient, encouraging her to scream at the top of her lungs. Something that is instinctively, innately difficult for this person. We never would have imagined that she could do it the first week of her care here, but she's been doing it. And when I asked her what did it feel like, she smiled and said, it felt good. So the frame of reference has to be very different from the typical reference that is used in managing anorexia nervosa. And with that, we have 10 minutes for questions. Thank you. And again, you're welcome to have these slides.
Thanks, Dr. Strober, for a very thought-provoking presentation. My question pertains to, and was triggered by the picture that you showed of the woman who lost 50% of her body mass in several months, and at the suggestion that maybe she needs to go to a hospital, she said, that's ridiculous, I need to lose more weight. How do you think of the psychological mechanism that maintains that? Would that be a lack of insight, a perceptual distortion of some kind, a distortion in belief processes? How do you think of the mechanism of being able to maintain that she needs to lose weight in the face of let's say, incontrovertible evidence to the contrary?
Well, I think I see Jamie Fusner in the back row. Jamie, is that you? No. Ja- I'll let him know. Okay. Jamie Fusner and I reported a couple of years ago, and maybe this speaks to your question, Peter, about what's the center of this, that an evolutionarily old part of the visual information processing circuitry seems to be inactive when it is exposed to a degraded stimulus. And that degraded stimulus in this particular study was a neutral object. So there may be some primary evolutionarily conserved trait that leads to this strange anomalous perception of the body's present mass. The other factor that operates, and again, speaking to the heart of this, to the center of this, is that some of us have traits that were conserved during evolution that are at the margin. They're at the extreme. And that lingers on, activated in some way, or I should say accentuated as you confront novelties that are part of the transition from childhood to adolescence. Remember that in the life history of people with anorexia nervosa is a whole suite of anxious behaviors. It precedes by years the onset of weight loss. There's something about the initial avoidance of nutrients that is a releasing factor we don't know, but it's not malnutrition. This begins well before there is malnutrition. And it can continue in a good number of cases after weight is restored. Dean.
Thank you for this great talk.
Thank you.
A common element in the family unit of such patients is an over-controlling mother.
Whoa.
Quite sometimes,
You think
no.
I was his stat?
Yes. But one easy explanation is that it's a normal secondary response to the mother in the face of the problem.
Yes.
But I wonder whether you can speculate as to its possible phylogenetic or adaptive implications of this relationship.
Well, there are implications. But as to the question, is this common in the families of people with anorexia nervosa? I wouldn't say it's common. Does it occur? Yes. Is it in the minority of families? Yes. It's the minority of families. However, an anxious child looks for guidance. The anxious child looks for dependency. The anxious child looks for solace. The anxious child looks for a means of avoiding the novelty that she feels ill-prepared to manage. So you do see these adaptive changes that take place given the interaction between early traits and developmental behavior and interactions between parent and child that are meaningful.
Hi, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I'm wondering about traditional treatments using CBT, using mindfulness, maybe using some art therapy. What do you have to comment on some of those?
Well, we do that. We do as much as possible. There's a reason for having within a multidimensional treatment program art, mindfulness. They are activities that the majority of people with anorexia nervosa shy away from. They're formless. They don't have boundaries. They don't have definition. And remember the developmental traits that are universal in anorexia nervosa. Every person with anorexia nervosa has that suite of traits that I mentioned. It is not in their nature to work with things that feel like clouds. that are formless, emotion included. So we engage them in a process that they believe, with some justification, they're not well prepared to take on. The majority of patients, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 5 months, 7 months into the treatment, express their emotion. They challenge boundaries. They're willing to take on things that they wouldn't consider months ago. So all of these things have relevance within a framework that is sensible given what we know or should know about the ultimate causation. Because the ultimate causation, and these reflected in these ancestral traits that are designed to be protective, that result in an over-habitization of behavior, behavior that's suffused with anxiousness. Given that, we assume that we have to help them become immersed in the very thing that they are ill-prepared to tolerate.
Yes, thanks for an excellent talk. Do you know what percentage of successfully treated adolescent anorexics relapse as adults? And the second related to that is, do you know like what percentage of anorexia nervosa has adult onset first time symptoms?
Those are very good questions. Anorexia nervosa beginning de novo, without any premonitory behavior, is after age 20 is very rare. Most studies of adults with anorexia nervosa show, unsurprisingly, that they were ill as young adolescents or middle adolescents. And as to the first question, in a study, that question has not been studied as often as it should. In a study that we published in '97, we asked the question, if you reach the point of recovery, very stringently defined, no aspect of the illness whatsoever. If you go to exercise, you don't do it because your body mass is threatening you. You don't weigh yourself. You don't go to a restaurant and demand from the waiter or waitress the calorie count of each item ordered. None of that is present. The likelihood of a subsequent relapse, and this was investigated in a 10 to 15-year prospective study, the likelihood of a subsequent relapse was 0. Do people with anorexia nervosa relapse after weight restoration? Yes, they do, which obviously calls into the question the falsehood that this is an illness that it precipitates from malnutrition. So when your weight is restored, everything's just going to be terrific. Patients are told that. Families are told that. It's manifestly false.
I guess the problem I have is fitting your evolutionary concepts, what I know to be your great sophistication in treatment. Yeah. So you're going to have to help me with that later, because I wonder about, certainly anorexics run. We all know that's something sort of crazy that they do. But when you come back to the speeding antelope, I have all sorts of questions about how that really fits, because the argument could be, well, the rational individual, humans, take this early experience of running when they're frightened, yes, and from there they extrapolate it into the syndromes that we find in anorexia nervosa. I don't know whether that's a reasonable hypothesis or not, but I have trouble putting the two things together. So if anybody else in the audience has that, we should all come and ask him about that question.
You're
But anyway,
welcome. You're
a very good talk, but I'm perplexed. So
you came late.
I know. I was going to confess that, but I thought, well, no, I'd try you first. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'll be happy to address that
Yeah,
question.
thank you.